Hello, my name is Eric Barreto. I teach New Testament at Luther Seminary, and today I have a paper I'd like to present to you called Negotiating Difference, Theology and Ethnicity in the Acts of the Apostles. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Randy for his kind invitation to take part in this conference, and would like to express my regret that I'm not able to attend in person, but very thankful for these technological efforts that allow us to be together for me this morning, for you this afternoon. Just a quick word about the paper. This is it's one of my first efforts at developing a wider project and book that deals with the theology of ethnicity in the book of Acts. My basic contention is that for the author of Acts, ethnic differences and racial differences are not an obstacle for the gospel. They're not an obstacle to be overcome, or these differences don't have to be honed down for the sake of the gospel. Instead, what we have in Acts is a church living into the many differences that characterize the ancient world and continue to characterize our world today. So what I'll do is I'll read a few passages from the paper that you probably think have in front of you. You'll be able to follow along as well. Read a little bit from the introduction and then spend some time talking about Pentecost and two stories in Acts chapter 16. I look forward to our conversation, so let's get started. Race and ethnicity are powerful forces. Racial and ethnic notions have forged communities and torn neighbors asunder. Racial and ethnic identities have helped people face the world's challenges with solidarity. Racial and ethnic prejudice has precipitated both mere dislike and violent warfare. Race and ethnicity, in short, are inevitable features of human life, whenever and wherever we gather to form communities of fictive kinship. Whether for good or ill, race and ethnicity are inescapable. Too many biblical scholars have, however, tended to neglect or otherwise marginalize the presence, function, and importance of ethnic difference in the texts of the Bible. Though many are motivated by the positive hope that the gospel might bring to pass a world in which racial and ethnic animus are a remnant of the distant past, such neglect has left this central feature of human life underexplored. Moreover, theological analysis of ethnic difference has too often not examined the complexities and even contradictions present when we engage in discourses of race and ethnicity, devolved into simple binaries, or simply neglected this central notion of identity. The Acts of the Apostles is a natural home for exegetes hoping to make sense of the rich diversity of God's people. At root, Acts narrates the intrusion of the gospel into the myriad populations that dotted the landscape around the Mediterranean in antiquity. Propelled by persecution and the Spirit's guidance, these first followers of Jesus carry the gospel message to the very ends of the earth. A number of cultural boundaries are crossed in Acts, but at no point does Luke narrate the cessation of ethnic difference. Instead, the text invites us to enter a world in which ethnic difference and faithful unity coexist. So let's move now and talk a little bit about the exegesis of the text itself. At core, the author of Luke Acts views our differences as a gift from God to be treasured, not a difficulty to be overcome. Ethnic and racial differences are not the problem that curses the human family. Instead, prejudice and racism inject our differences with the sinful notion that our differences lead to superiority and inferiority, or the distorted belief that our differences are merely cultural cues for determining who is in and who is out, rather than emblems of God's gift of diversity. Now I'm in the section that's called What Role Do Race and Ethnicity Play in the Acts of the Apostles? Luke cannot help but think of ethnicity when composing Acts. After all, the travel itinerary of Acts' main protagonists covers a broad swath of the ancient world. As Acts 1:8 indicates, these earliest proclaimers of the gospel moved from Jerusalem to Judea, to Samaria, and finally to the very edges of the known world. From its first chapter, therefore, Acts narrates the crossing of ethnic and cultural boundaries. Acts guides us through some of the great cities of antiquity, finally finding Paul preaching unencumbered at the urban seat of Roman power. The negotiation of ethnic boundaries is part of the very narrative fabric of Acts. So now let's turn to Pentecost. The extended scene of the promised outpouring of the Spirit in Pentecost is a powerful story. Jesus promises his disciples to send a gift to them both at the conclusion of Luke's Gospel as well as the opening verses in Acts. That promise comes to fulfillment in Acts 2, right as the city of Jerusalem is teeming with visitors from around the world. Tongues of fire descend upon the gathered faithful as the Holy Spirit grants the power to speak in other languages. Such a miracle baffles the Judaioi gathered for the festival from every corner of the Roman Empire. In 2:5-11, Acts outlines the ethnic identities of all these peoples in detail. Now, whether Luke is here imitating some other forms of ancient literature is unclear, though entirely possible. What may be clearer, though, is the nature of the scene he paints. Despite their sharing of a faith that draws them from great distances, these gathered masses are not homogeneous. They are not all entirely alike. It is this scene of ethnic and linguistic diversity in which the Holy Spirit makes a grand appearance. Each person here hears the gospel proclaimed in her own language. The Holy Spirit, notice, does not speak with one language, but with all the languages of the human tableau. Now, if you have had any experiences with foreign languages, the enormity of this feat is even starker. Remember that languages do not correlate exactly. That is, you cannot speak a new language by looking up individual words in a dictionary and translating them accordingly. One has to learn the language at a deeper syntactical level. Moreover, language and culture are inextricably tied together. So the Holy Spirit's translation of the gospel must cross not just linguistic boundaries, but cultural and ethnic ones as well. In this scene, the differences among us are not made void or ended. The Holy Spirit does not force all those gathered in Jerusalem to hear the gospel in a universal heavenly language. Instead, the Holy Spirit accommodates and lives into the multiplicity of human language and culture as a direct expression of the gospel's wide reach over all the peoples of the world. Now, to be sure, the story of Babel lies in the background here, which we can find, of course, in Genesis 11. That story sought to comprehend how human cultural and linguistic diversity came about. Here, Luke pursues a similar, though not identical, thought. How can the good news of Jesus be proclaimed in a world rife with ethnic and linguistic diversity? How can the gospel find expression in other tongues and cultures? What will bind these believers together? Pentecost suggests that this sharing occurs in the very midst of ethnic diversity, with the Spirit's intervention as a binding agent. The Spirit permits all to hear the gospel in their own vernacular and in their own cultural context, without requiring our differences to be brought to an end. The Parthians and Medes, Cretans and Arabs that filled Jerusalem that fateful Pentecost day did not leave their ethnic identities behind in order to follow the Messiah. Instead, the Spirit spoke in the multiplicity of human languages to draw all near to God. Let me just say a bit more about what I think is happening here in the Pentecost story, is that I think Pentecost, and here Luke, is certainly reading back the story of Babel. But I think Luke does not read the story of Babel as a story that outlines the punishments that God inflicted upon the people of the world. He, I think, like Babel and the author of Genesis, don't see the multiplicity of human languages as a problem to be solved. But instead, it's a reality. It's what God wanted for us. And there's a much wider argument here to be made here in the reading of Genesis, which I will do elsewhere. But just to introduce that basic argument here, that the reading that I have of Babel, that I think is one that Luke shares, is that Babel is not a punishment. Babel is part of God's creative activity in the world, creating a diverse a diverse world made of different peoples. But we can talk more about that in the question section. Let's turn to Acts 16 now. All right. First, let's turn to those first 5 verses in Acts 16. This is a section called Negotiating Identities on Timothy's Body. The opening verses of Acts 16 are both brief and enigmatic. Much is left unsaid in this rather controversial moment of Pauline biography in Acts. In verse 1, we are introduced to Timothy, a disciple whose father was Greek and whose mother was Judaios, and a believer. His reputation is generally sterling, but he faces one significant obstacle to the work Paul hopes to accomplish alongside him. The Jews who were in those places, my translation of 16:3, knew that his father was Greek, and thus are suspicious of Timothy's fealty to Jewish religious and ethnic practices. To preempt this concern, Paul has Timothy circumcised. Now, lest we think this circumcision violates the conclusions of the Apostolic Council in chapter 15, verse 4 recounts that Paul and Timothy successfully communicate its decision. This brief narration leaves many gaps in the story. Why was Timothy not circumcised as a child? Some scholars have theorized that his father might have prohibited it, or that local cultural pressures de-incentivized it. But Luke provides no clarification. Moreover, what was the ethnic status of Timothy prior to his circumcision? What was his ethnic status following his circumcision? Notice that at no point does Acts attach a single clarifying ethnic term to Timothy. Now, much scholarship has wondered whether Timothy would have been considered a Jew or a Gentile in antiquity. Yet the narrative suggests that this question may miss a wider point. Timothy never receives a clarifying ethnic appellation because his ethnic identity remains irreducibly mixed. He remains, even after his circumcision, the product of a mixed marriage, and thus both Jewish and Greek. In the end, Timothy embodies an ethnic seam running through the end of Acts, representing the ethnic divide between Jew and Greek with which the church in Acts needed to grapple. As a side note, one thing to notice, I think, if you do a careful search of Acts, as well as the Gospel of Luke, is that when Luke wants to talk about the whole world, he doesn't talk about Jews and Gentiles so much as he talks about Jews and Greeks. That's the way that he separates, that he cleaves the two halves of the world. Maybe not even two halves, but the two big parts of the world. Is that you're either Jewish or you're Greek. And I think it's no incident then that Timothy embodies this divide of the world and embodies the unity that brings together both Jew and Greek in the gospel in all their difference, and without erasing the fact that some are Jews and some are Greeks. Anyway, evidence for this conclusion can be found in Timothy's fleeting appearances in the closing chapters of Acts. Paul's role in the circumcision of Timothy never emerges again, even when he is accused of teaching Jews to forsake their ancestral ways. He very well could have pointed to Timothy's circumcision as a way to defend himself, but he doesn't. But Timothy's presence is noted 4 times in the final chapters of Acts. In none of these instances does Timothy play a prominent role in Luke's storytelling. He's only one among Paul's entourage. But I think his presence is powerfully symbolic. In these lists, Timothy is not a stranger, an alien, or an outsider whose presence requires justification. As I have argued elsewhere, he is no longer under the critical gaze of those who would question his fractured ethnic identity. Instead, he is wholly a part of a movement that does not erase one's ethnic origins, but finds ways to embrace these differences. He shows that ethnic incertitude is no obstacle to the gospel, and that ethnic purity is not requisite for membership in the multi-ethnic people of God. Now let's talk about a Roman citizen, the last part of chapter 16. Ethnic controversies continued later in Acts 16 with the arrival of Paul and his retinue in Philippi. Paul has already discovered a place of prayer populated by faithful women on the outskirts of the city, and found success in proclaiming the gospel to Lydia and her household. On his way to the place of prayer, Paul would regularly encounter a mantic girl whose prophetic abilities were exploited by her master for economic gain. Driven to the edge of impatience, Paul reacts apparently without too much forethought. He ejects the spirit and precipitates the impending tumult. The business syndicate brings Paul and Silas before the local authorities, accusing them not of ruining their enterprise, but of destabilizing the fragile social, cultural, and political fabric of this Roman colony. And what they do is that they posit a stark contrast. These Judaioi, these Jews, are asking us to do something that we Romans ought not do. The ethnocentric accusation is unmistakable. And as Richard Purbo recently concluded, the owners were shrewd enough to mask their avarice with a potent brew concocted from the ultimate resort of the scoundrel, a dose of old-time religion and a garnish of racism. It's just a beautiful quote. The accusations are so effective that Paul and Silas end up at the receiving end of a brutal physical attack and are imprisoned. A miraculous earthquake and the conversion of a guard fill the long narrative night. The next day brings seeming liberation. For unknown reasons, the local authorities decide to release Paul and Silas. But Paul has been affronted by their previous day's events, and he refuses to leave quietly. He makes a bold declaration that I think has been poorly translated recently. Most modern translations, in English at least, record Paul's claim of Roman citizenship in 1637 through 38. However, the same ethnic terminologies, Romaios, plainly and simply, is used in these verses as in the accusation leveled against Paul and Silas earlier in verse 21. The addition of a claim to citizenship is not entirely misplaced. The rights of citizenship are certainly in view here. But pointing to these verses solely to a claim to Roman citizenship misses a key narrative theme. Paul's claim to be Roman is a direct refutation of the scurrilous accusation brought against him and Silas. The claim is not merely or solely juridical or legal, but I would argue ethnic in nature. Paul's assertion is a bold claim that he and Silas are not contraveners of the local culture, but they are truly at home in these Roman environs. In claiming to be Roman, they do not therefore challenge the accusation of verse 20. They indeed are Judaioi, they are Jews. But that ethnic identity does not naturally lead to the conclusion reached by the sinister business syndicate. Scholars have frequently seen in the story a glimpse into Pauline biography. This may be a case, but such a focus may miss the narrative and theological implications of the Luke and Paul's claim. Paul is not merely claiming political rights due to a citizen, but undercutting wholly the baseless accusations lobbed their way. Paul and Silas are not a threat to this Roman colony, for they indeed are Romans. In this way, Luke narrates how the early church negotiated a space in the midst of the teeming ethnic diversity of the ancient world. Paul and Silas are both Jewish and Roman. These two identities are not at odds, and they, along with other believers, do not have to sacrifice their ethnic and cultural identities in order to be faithful followers of Jesus. In some of my other work, I've used especially the post-colonial category of hybridity to explain how it is that Luke's Paul is both Jewish and Roman, and the complicated ways in which imperial powers they're negotiated, so that often there'll be discussions about acts, whether it's pro-empire or anti-empire. I think the category of hybridity complicates that question and suggests that there might be a third alternative between accommodation and violent resistance. But we can talk more about that again in the discussion time. Just a quick conclusion. The vision of the world Acts propounds is one in which ethnic differences are taken seriously, but are not presumed to be inherently problematic in the creation of communities of faith. In narrative form, Acts forwards a powerful theological argument that faithful unity and ethnic diversity are neither at odds nor mutually exclusive. Luke simply cannot fathom a world in which our differences are transcended or effaced, but narrates a church in which ethnic differences are taken seriously, but not allowed to divide us between the inferior and the superior. Certainly, cultural contexts have shifted in the intervening centuries, but analogous pressures today demand an equally robust theological response. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your comments and your questions.